Because the moment you stop engaging, the game ends. They don't know how to operate without a willing participant. And the tragedy, at least from their point of view, is that you've exited the stage without permission. Now, let's be clear. This silence can come in deceptive forms. They may disappear, hoping their absence will cause confusion or panic. They might ignore you publicly while stalking you in private. But the critical distinction here is your internal shifting. You're not responding. You're not triggered. You've moved from defense to indifference, and that is essentially threatening to someone who has built their identity around controlling others. This kind of silence from a narcissist also reveals their limits. You've exposed the fundamental emptiness beneath their facade. When they can no longer provoke you, they have no more tools. The manipulation toolbox, guilt, charm, rage, projection. It's all useless. And once they're rendered powerless, many don't even bother to pretend anymore. They just vanish. Some seek new supply, others spiral. But rarely do they return in the same form because they know the mask has slipped and you saw what was underneath. And here's where the deeper philosophical insight leads. Your liberation didn't come from overpowering them. It came from mastering yourself. That's the real victory. You didn't win by shouting louder or playing their game better. You won by stepping out of the game entirely. By reclaiming your autonomy, by refusing to live reactively, you broke the cycle. In a world that rewards outrage and ego, choosing stillness and clarity is a radical act. So the next time the narcissist goes quiet, don't fear the silence. Listen to it. It's not the calm before another storm. It's the sound of their control dissolving. And in that silence, you'll hear something else. Yourself, finally free to speak. One of the most brutal yet revealing signs that you've truly defeated a narcissist is when they initiate a smear campaign against you. It's a predictable, almost mechanical reaction, like the final spasm of a machine that no longer serves its purpose. But make no mistake, this is not random. It's a desperate, last-ditch attempt to regain control, not over you directly, because that door has closed, but over how others perceive you. They can no longer manipulate your reality, so they attempt to redefine it through the eyes of others. This tells us something profound. The narcissist's sense of identity is not grounded internally. It's a house of mirrors, entirely dependent on reflection, on how others view them, on how much admiration or fear they can extract. When you remove yourself from that system, you become a liability, and that's where the smear campaign begins. It's not about truth. It's not even about convincing others. It's about rewriting the narrative to avoid the ultimate humiliating exposure. From a psychological lens, what we're observing is the narcissist's need to preserve what Carl Jung might have called the persona, the false self, carefully constructed to mask the chaotic, wounded ego beneath. When you detach, when you no longer play the role assigned to you, be it the caretaker, the scapegoat, the enabler, you force them to confront the collapse of that persona. Rather than face this internally, they project the collapse outward. They say, look at what she did, or he's gone crazy. They paint themselves as the victim, the misunderstood hero, and you as the villain, the unstable one, the liar. Now, here's the paradox. The more distorted the lies, the more threatened they feel. They escalate not because they're confident, but because they're panicking. This is psychological displacement in its rawest form. Rather than feel shame or guilt, they cast those feelings onto you. And for a time, this might work. People might believe them. Friends, family, even colleagues might be swayed by their performance. That can be deeply painful, especially if you've spent years trying to build trust and live with integrity. But this is where your endurance becomes your greatest asset, because smear campaigns by nature are unsustainable. Truth has gravity. Over time, people start to notice the inconsistencies. They see how the narcissist's stories change depending on the audience. They watch how calm and measured you remain in contrast to their chaos. And the narcissist's power begins to decay, slowly then suddenly. Philosophically, this process speaks to a deeper theming, the war between illusion and authenticity. When you step out of the narcissist's narrative, you commit to truth, even when it's lonely, even when it's costly. That's what makes the smear campaign so vicious. It punishes you for daring to be real in a world addicted to appearances. But that's also why, in the long run, it's a sign you've already won. You've exposed the weakness behind the mask. You've survived the storm without becoming part of it. So if you're being smeared, Don't panic. Don't retaliate. Just keep living in a way that contradicts every lie they tell. Let your character outlast their chaos. Because the most powerful story is the one told by your actions. Quiet, consistent, and impossible to fake. One of the most undeniable signs that a narcissist has lost control is when their manipulation no longer works. Not just on you, but on others as well. You begin to notice a shift. Their once irresistible charm starts to fall flat. Their dramatic stories don't evoke the same sympathy they used to. People, maybe even those who once defended them, start raising eyebrows, asking questions, stepping back. It's subtle at first, but it grows. And for the narcissist, it's devastating. You see, narcissistic manipulation depends entirely on control over perception. Their entire strategy hinges on convincing others of a particular narrative about who they are, about who you are, and about what's happening. They're skilled at this, often pathologically so. They can be charismatic, persuasive, even magnetic. They tailor their persona to suit the audience using praise, guilt, tears, or outrage, depending on what gets results. But all of that is performative. It's not real strength. It's not truth. It's theater. And like all theater, the illusion breaks the moment the audience stops suspending disbelief. What we're dealing with here, psychologically, is a fragile self that relies on external validation to maintain any sense of coherence. Narcissists don't build identity through values or integrity. They construct it through manipulation. By managing impressions, exploiting vulnerabilities, and maintaining dominance in relationships. But the structure is unstable because it depends on others continuing to believe a lie. Once people begin to see through it, the system collapses. This collapse isn't always dramatic. Often it's quiet, almost anticlimactic. Friends stop returning their calls. Coworkers stop laughing at their jokes. Family members stop volunteering emotional labor. The narcissist starts noticing that the usual tactics, triangulation, gaslighting, charm offensives, no longer land the way they once did. And internally, this triggers something akin to panic. They've spent years, sometimes decades, refining their ability to manipulate the social field. When that fails, they're left with nothing to fall back on. No authentic self, no enduring sense of meaning, just ego and fear. And it's in this moment that your power becomes most evident. Not in confrontation, not in some grand scene of vindication, but in the quiet, steady erosion of their influence. You don't need to expose them. The truth does that over time. You just have to remain grounded, consistent, and clear-headed. When you refuse to play their game, when you don't feed the drama, when you live honestly despite their false narratives, others eventually start to notice. They begin to compare your behavior with the narcissist's words. And the disconnect speaks volumes. Philosophically, this speaks to a deeper principle. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to endure. Narcissists rely on noise, on distortion, on emotional confusion. But clarity, real clarity, is contagious. Once one person sees through the mask, it becomes easier for others to do the same. The web unravels. So when you realize their manipulation no longer works, not on you and not on others, you're witnessing something powerful, the collapse of a false reality. And in that collapse, you're reminded of something essential, that truth in the end is stronger than control. There's a precise moment in your recovery, often quiet and unceremonious, when you realize the narcissist no longer has the ability to provoke you. You hear their voice, see their name, maybe even encounter them face to face, and nothing. No rush of anxiety, no need to defend, no impulse to explain, fix, or even retaliate. You feel calm, detached, free. That moment, though subtle, is deeply significant because emotional detachment is the psychological equivalent of cutting the puppet strings. And make no mistake, the narcissist has spent considerable energy tying those strings to your emotions. They've studied your reactions, learned your insecurities, poked at your boundaries, and conditioned you to exist in a state of hypervigilance. When you detach, you dismantle that entire system. You stop being a resource. And you stop being a mirror. And for someone who feeds off your emotional responsiveness, that is total defeat. From a psychological standpoint, what's occurring here is a profound shift in internal authority. You're no longer outsourcing your sense of self to their opinions or approval. You're no longer organizing your behavior around their moods. You're stepping into what Jung might have called individuation, the process of becoming whole and autonomous. And in doing so, you strip away the narcissist's central source of leverage, your emotional reactivity. Now, emotional detachment is often misunderstood. It's not indifference in the cold, cynical sense. It's not apathy or repression. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the result of confronting your pain head-on, processing it, integrating it, and emerging with clarity. When you reach this stage, you're not numb. You're free. You can feel without being hijacked. You can remember without relapsing. That's real strength. And here's what's so telling: narcissists don't know what to do with this version of you. The strategies they once relied on, provocation, guilt-tripping, emotional baiting, they stop working. You don't rise to the bait. You don't defend yourself against their distortions. You simply don't need their version of you to be false anymore, because it no longer defines you. That's psychological sovereignty. And it's terrifying to someone whose entire existence is built on control. Philosophically, what you're doing here is reclaiming your moral agency. You're refusing to be defined by manipulation and instead choosing to act according to your values, your truth, your dignity. That's a courageous act, especially in the wake of emotional abuse, because it requires that you center your internal compass and accept that your worth is not contingent on being understood or validated by someone who never truly saw you to begin with. This kind of detachment, true, earned, and grounded, cannot be faked. It's not about silence, distance, or revenge. It's about the quiet confidence that you are no longer available for their games. That's what renders the narcissist powerless. Not confrontation, not revenge, but absence, emotional absence. You've exited the psychological arena, and they're left shadowboxing with themselves. And that's where your victory lies. Not in loud declarations, but in calm resolve. Not in changing them, but in no longer needing to. Because the moment you no longer react is the moment they cease to matter. When the narcissist senses that their grip is gone, when your detachment is real, when old tricks no longer provoke a response, they often reach for their final weapon, the victim narrative. Suddenly, the person who spent years undermining, manipulating, and violating boundaries becomes the one who's been hurt, abandoned, or abused. It's a bewildering reversal. But from their perspective, it's a logical next move. If they can't control the dynamic by domination, they'll attempt to control it by evoking pity. This tactic taps into something profoundly human, our instinct to protect the vulnerable, to respond to suffering with compassion. And that's exactly what makes it so insidious. The narcissist is not just seeking sympathy, they're weaponizing it. They're not wounded, they're exposed. And in their mind, exposure is synonymous with annihilation. So they reconstruct themselves as the victim, not to heal, but to manipulate, to reframe the story in their favor, to regain control not over you, perhaps, but over the social narrative, over the sympathies of others, sometimes even over institutions, courts, workplaces, social groups. Psychologically, this is a projection of inner fragility. Deep down, many narcissists carry a profound fear of worthlessness masked by layers of arrogance or charm. When their false self begins to crack, when they are no longer admired or feared, they default to self-pity because it's the only socially acceptable mask left. Rage and dominance no longer serve them, so they switch tactics. But the motive remains unchanged control. You'll often notice this shift when they begin rewriting history. Suddenly, your boundary setting becomes cruelty. Your withdrawal becomes abandonment. Your healing becomes betrayal. And if others aren't familiar with the dynamics of narcissistic abuse, they may fall for it. That can be painful, deeply so. Especially if mutual friends, family members, or colleagues are taken in by the performance. But this is where your discernment must be sharp. Because the real question is not how do they appear, but what do they need from this performance? And the answer is always power. Not peace, not resolution. Power. Philosophically, we can view this through the lens of existential responsibility. The narcissist refuses to take accountability for their role in the dynamic. That would require confronting shame, regret, and the truth of their behavior, so they outsource that pain to you. They insist that someone must pay for their discomfort. And if not through direct manipulation, then through guilt, pity, and social distortion. It's a refusal to grow up, a desperate clinging to a childish worldview where the self is always innocent and suffering is always unjustified. But here's the crucial pointing: when their victim act no longer moves you, when you can observe it without internalizing it, you've not only seen through the illusion, you've transcended it. You recognize it for what it is, an echo of the same manipulation, now dressed in vulnerability. And you choose not to play along that decision. To see clearly, to feel compassion without enabling, to refuse re-entry into a toxic loop is the embodiment of emotional maturity. It's what finally breaks the cycle. Because the moment you stop confusing their suffering with your responsibility is the moment you start honoring your freedom. The clearest, the most undeniable sign that you've defeated a narcissist isn't in their reaction. It's in your transformation. It's not measured by their silence, their smear campaigns, or their collapsing manipulation, though all of those are important markers. It's measured by something deeper, your return to yourself. Your ability to live without fear, without guilt, and without the constant psychological tension of managing someone else's emotional chaos. That's the real victory. That's what they can't counterfeit or corrupt. For many people who've been entangled with narcissists, daily life becomes a kind of performance. You adjust your tone, second-guess your words, anticipate emotional traps, and walk on eggshells. Every choice is filtered through the question, how will they react? That's not a relationship. That's a state of psychological captivity, and escaping it isn't just about going no contact or setting boundaries. It's about reconstructing your internal architecture. It's about relearning how to live as someone who belongs to themselves. And that reconstruction isn't easy. It demands that you grieve the fantasy, the idea that this person might change, that love could fix it, that you were ever truly safe in their approval. It requires facing the wounds that made you vulnerable to them in the first place, often wounds that go back years, even decades. But through that process, something remarkable happens. You begin to make choices again, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of alignment with your values, your vision, your truth. You learn to trust your instincts. You rediscover your voice. You build a life that isn't dictated by manipulation, but by meaning. What terrifies the narcissist most isn't your anger, it's your independence, your ability to exist without them. Because for all their grandiosity, they are profoundly dependent creatures. They need control, validation, and emotional reactions to feel real. They cannot stand being irrelevant. So when you take back control, not just externally, but internally, you become a living contradiction to their worldview. You prove that people can leave and grow. That healing is possible. That fear is not a permanent condition. Philosophically, what we're